Hey, you too, it's
Oh,
Eric. With George again here tonight. We're gonna have like another quick chat, like an hour to two, and we're just gonna talk about just some of the recent stuff that's going on. In particular, New Zealand will be passing their gun legislation. Um, you said the 12th this month, George, March 12th. That's the impending gun control bill, and like all typically like as we like predicted, like it's a typical gun grab. They're coming for all. So they're gonna make it impossible for citizens in New Zealand to be able to defend themselves. They're gonna have all the guns in the hands of the militarized police force. So we're going to start off, and then we're also going to go into how the Roman Catholic recently, the Venezuelan Catholic bishops have declared President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela an illegitimate ruler. So you can see like who the real like player behind this like coup d'état is. The current Black Pope Arturo Sosa is from Venezuela, and the pretender or like the opposition leader Juan Guaido, who the Vatican, the United States, and NATO is backing. The Jesuit government in Canada is backing this coup. But Juan Guaido says he's going to give Venezuela's nationalized oil to the American and British oil companies. So you see, like, so the Vatican, the oil companies in the Vatican have a very long history. Going back to like the 1920s. In the 1920s, in the intervention in Mexico. But yeah, George, if you want to go into the New Zealand stuff first,
okay. Well, thank
yeah,
you.
to start with what we were what you were saying before we went live.
Well, hello, Eric. This is George from County, California, about an hour or so north of San Francisco. There are a number of things I wanted to discuss. And yes, as Eric brought up, uh, I'd like to talk a little bit about the situation in New Zealand, the very unfortunate situation in New Zealand. And Johnny, when he was doing the show, he, I guess, had a regular listener there named Alan. And Alan actually sent me something yesterday, or I guess it would be today because they're 16 or 18 hours ahead of where I live. And Alan sent me a bunch of articles, local articles from New Zealand, from their papers and their media about the implications, about how there's been as you just said a moment ago, there's been a concerted effort in recent years to militarize law enforcement in New Zealand. And unbeknownst to me, and I imagine most people who don't live there, the gun laws until basically now have been relatively lax, not perhaps as say lax as though here in America, particularly in places like Arizona or Texas. However, in light of what happened on March the 15th, the Ides of March, uh, that all changed. Now, I don't mean to sound superstitious or anything like that, but the Jesuits always like Kabbalah. They often will choose a certain date because it has significance to them. Now, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, whether he actually was a real person or or was the author of any of those plays, that's a different story altogether. Uh, Julius Caesar was supposed to have been killed on March the 15th. Was it 44 BC or whatever it was? And there's a famous line of playing, be aware of the Ides of March. And as I said, these shootings were supposed to have taken place on the 15th of March. And so I guess.
Well, I know the Port Arthur shooting that happened in Australia in like 1996. That was also in March.
Oh, okay. So
I
the
don't know that I don't
key.
know if that's just a coincidence, but it's interesting. I'm pretty sure
So
there's
the key.
a lot of the false flags have happened in March. Just like
Yes.
another just significant time around April. Just I thought that when I found this out, I thought it was interesting because April 20th is like the holiday for 420. It's like a holiday where everyone celebrates to get high, but we don't hit. April 20th was the birthday of Adolf Hitler, and I think
Yes.
possibly that has some because a lot of these Hitler has been idolized to like an incredible degree. Like there was like the American Bund marches even going back to the 30s. But Hitler has been like idolized in America, and the system idolizes Hitler. So possibly his birthday has something to do with it as well. But ultimately, like the Jesuits are very astrologically minded. Like just I don't we don't just keep going. I'll just say this: like I read on my video on George Washington, I read an excerpt. This is from the book Manly P. Hall, The Secret Destiny of America. But he was quoting the professor character, who is said to have been at the founding of the American Revolution. But the professor, was talking about like the sun rising in Capricorn, setting in Cancer, and like rising in like the governmental firmament of this of the heavens, like their eternal empire being created. So and like the Jesuit, their symbol is a sun disk. Like astrology can actually be, you can see astrology symbols at Catholic churches. Like I saw pictures of there's this Catholic cathedral in Rome where you can see like all the 12 zodiacal signs. Hitler himself was into astrology. I haven't read this book, but there's a book that was written. There's like I heard Mae Brussel reference this book, but like one of Hitler's astrologers actually wrote a book on like how astrology like guided the Nazi regime. I'm saying, but like it has a like, especially with the Jesuits, like the occult side of like the narrative just has a like has it was like, for example, it was Helena Blavatsky, who is known as like one of the best authorities on like the study of occultism. Helena Blavatsky said like the Jesuits are like the biggest black magicians in the world. For instance, and she said the Jesuits do practice occultism. So like, it's important to know. Like it's not always just the Jesuits are primarily political and military, like a military order, but like there is like an occult side to the Jesuits. Like they're priests, like they're a priesthood. Like they study, like the ancient pagan sciences of like the priesthoods of, Egypt, Babylonia, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, funny, it's interesting, Eric, you should mention Mae Brussel because you actually turned me on to her. I mentioned this before. Prior to a few months ago, I never actually heard of her. And she died about 30 years ago, back in 1988, at the age of 66. And she died, she was time of cancer, although I think she may have been given that. I mean, I have no proof. But now, for those who may not have heard of Mae Brussel, her name was Brussels, like the Belgian capital, except for no S in the end. Mae, M-A-E. And you can look at, for those who are interested, you can go look up her videos, and you could say she was a legitimate female Alex Jones slash Bill Hicks. But I think she was real. Now, her politics, she was a Jewish lady who was a Democrat, and her politics were a bit leftist center. But I believe she was an honest researcher because uh, she developed a fascination with the JFK assassination and the subsequent whitewash of the Warren Commission the following year. And she actually read the entire Warren report, which is something like 25, 26 volumes. So she was a real glutton for punishment. And she had a whole bunch of questions. She wished she could have asked people like Jerry Ford or whoever, Alan Dawes, the various figures that were John J. McCloy, the various figures were on the commission. One of the things she noticed, for instance, and I wasn't going to bring this up, is the commission didn't interview any Dallas cops. They didn't interview anybody who worked at the Texas School Depository, and the place where Oswald looked. They didn't actually subpoena his punch-out card, his time clock, and there's just like, even though they interviewed hundreds of people, they didn't interview a large number of important people, like his landlady.
I think with all of her work, she proved without a shadow of a doubt that Oswald was like a CIA asset. And,
yes.
it turned everything checks out. Like Oswald even spoke at the Jesuit Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, like 3 months before the shooting. Like she nailed it. Like And like I think she was honest too, because like her research led her to the Vatican. You know, most agents I find, like, they'll talk about the deep state, but when it comes down to like getting into specifics, it's always blaming Israel, or blaming like the all invasive octopus APAC lobby, for instance.
Mhm.
But
Now,
Mae
one of the
Brussell
things
didn't
she
do
did,
that. Like, she zeroed in on the Vatican, and in particular the Knights of Malta. Like she spoke on like Edmund Walsh. Like she knew Edmund Walsh for like the nefarious character that he was. Where she talked about Edmund Walsh's his connection to Nazis and him being at the Nuremberg trials. But I think you're
now,
right. Her actually getting like the actual full undocumented, because that Warren Commission report, like that was completely censored. Um, and like her getting that report was key. And I think another thing, a fact that validates her credibility, was how like viciously she was attacked by Mark Lane, for instance. Like Mark Lane wrote the book Rush to Judgment. That was like the first book that was written on the Kennedy assassination. And like for instance, like Mark Lane, I think he was the CIA puppet. They figured that they wanted to beat everyone to like they wanted to beat everyone to like questioning the alternative narrative of the JFK assassination. So Mark Lane wrote his book, but that's why Mark Lane went on William Buckley's show, The Firing Line. Knight of Malta, Jesuit trained William Buckley. But like Mark Lane, like Mae Brussell talked about this. Like, I recommend people listen to these lectures. But Mark Lane was like making all sorts of slanders about her. Calling her crazy,
well,
calling her like a wacko. Saying that she has no credibility, like making lies, saying that Mae Brussell was trying to like suck up to him and stuff like that. I'm saying like Mark Lane though was and Mark Lane actually reappeared at Jonestown, and she covered that, and it was fascinating because Mark Lane, after he supposedly was the author that was questioning the Warren Report, he literally became the lawyer for the People's Temple in 1976.
yeah,
Like Mae Brussell, is a victim of like a big like CIA media like smear job, like catapulted by Mark Lane. But I think if she was an agent, like they wouldn't have gone to the extent they did to discredit her.
well, she could have been. I mean, she was probably from a different era, the tail end of an era, the pre-internet stage. As I said, she died in the late 1980s, about over 30 years ago. That was just before people started going online. So, as I mentioned before, or at least like a private conversation with you, is I was amazed how much research she was able to do, because she had to do it the old-fashioned way by looking at books and newspapers and the old-fashioned print sources. So it wasn't as if she could go
Yeah, just
Google
old fashioned.
something.
She had friends, like she had like someone that would translate like the Italian newspapers for her. Like
And
for example, so she was able to see like what was going on, and like during the height of the Masonic P2 scandal, she was able to like read the Italian reports, which obviously were more like specific than like the reports coming out of like the New York Times and the Washington Post.
and well, not only that, but she had a radio audience. Now, as I said, I'd never heard of her until a few months ago. And even though she lived maybe about 3 hours or so south of where I am, I'm about an hour north of San Francisco. She's about 2 hours south of San Francisco, in Carmel, California. And I guess she had a radio program, or a couple of different radio programs in the 1970s and 80s. And she was on late at night, 10 p.m., 2 in the morning. So she had a late night audience, so where there were relatively few people listening. And she probably had maybe at most thousands of listeners, mostly in California. Although she was carried by delay across the country, and she actually has some listeners overseas, and probably some up in Canada. But as I said, she was probably from the tail end of the era to where you actually did have independent talk show personality. I don't want to say hosts, right? I didn't want to say personality. She wasn't really, well, a personality. It
Well, I
was
agree.
more.
Like for example, like in that era, like the Washington Post, like would you ever see the Washington Post nowadays like reporting on like CIA MK Ultra programs? I'm saying like the Washington Post was even doing that in like the late '70s. Like they had like that. I've archived them. Like there's like 6, 7 like MK Washington Post articles on like CIA mind control experiments. They even did an article how there was like a CIA mind control facility going on at Georgetown University. The doctor's name is Dr. Guy Seeker. Guy Seeker. It's like a German name. Like the Washington Post, like I've archived it, but like but you just don't see that anymore. For instance, like it's just a different era. Like even with the news broadcasts, like for instance, like that documentary I found on my channel on Charles Coughlin that was done by PBS in I think that was 1989. But you just don't see documentaries that reveal that much stuff anymore. Like as you know, like the Vatican in particular, but like financial forces have like tightened their squeeze on like journalism. Like now, for instance, like the Washington Post is owned by like the richest man in the world, like at least on paper, Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos got into a $600 million contract with the CIA. So that's probably why like you don't see like the same level of reporting from the Washington Post that they did in like the May Brussels era as they do now, because like they're in a contract with the CIA. Just for instance, like it's crazy. Like, have you seen like the Mother Jones magazine has like turned into like one of the biggest like RussiaGate parroters? And it's just crazy because in like the '80s, Mother Jones like they were doing articles on like the Knights of Malta and like the CIA connections to the mob, and like they've fallen so far. Like now they're calling Putin like an agent of Putin, and like it's like the Jesuit McCarthyism red baiting. But like it's across the board though. Like all like the New York Times isn't the same as it used to be. I've noticed. That's probably because the current CEO of the New York Times, Mark Thompson, was trained by Jesuits at Stonyhurst over in England. That's probably why the New York Times has been like in the New York Times was never like groundbreaking journalism, but like for instance like the New York Times, I read a story today by Tim Weiner. They're talking about CIA drug trafficking, but the New York Times, you don't see that level of reporting anymore, like just coming from just the mainstream sources.
Well, something I just mentioned a few minutes ago. I was talking about how TV and radio stations, and you can say this with newspapers, are basically just corporate. There's just here in America, if you pick up any daily newspaper in America, the San Jose Mercury News, the Charlotte Observer, the Kansas City Star, you're going to get local stories you'll hear about maybe a traffic accident or something like that, or a local obituary. But anything for the most part, national or international, you're going to have it filtered through a service. The Associated Press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, maybe Reuters, or probably less than 10 sources. So it's all been standardized and it's just basically corporate news. And you have that with radio, TV stations. For the most part, you just have.
Well, to say, George, there's pretty much only like 6 or 7 major conglomerates that control like all the news airwaves. Like you got Comcast, News Corporation, Time Warner, Disney, Hearst. But like there's a few more, but like just like there's literally there's such a monopoly on it. There's only like 7 or 8 companies that control like 99% of the airwaves in the United States. And yes, actually, for the viewers, the Dollar in the Vatican preface that I've been working on is now available on Amazon. If you type in the Dollar in the Vatican on the search bar, Aver Manhattan, that will come up. But like in my preface, there was a recent study that was done by the and I found this interesting, George, because like back in the 30s and the 40s, the U.S. government used to do their own internal monopoly investigations to check the rise of corporate power. But in 1981, under the Reagan administration, that stopped. So now there's no longer any government audits on like monopoly like power in the United States. So now like that's funny that it was under the Reagan administration, who was the closest to the Vatican in like the history of the United States that happened. So now third party groups have to do these like merger studies. But this group called it was Open Market Institute. They did a study called America's Concentration Crisis, and they analyzed like probably 30 different industries in the United States, ranging from like meat packing industry to cigarette manufacturing to like diapers to like software for cell phones. Like it's a pretty big list, and they find literally in every single industry, George, like there's 4 to 5. Like sometimes like cell phones, it's like a two. Like Apple and Samsung have a 99% market share for smartphone software, for instance. But every single industry has like 3 or 4 industries that 3 to 4 firms that control like 75% of the market share. Like it's crazy. Like how and like think of all the mergers. Like recently, like Dow Chemical merged with DuPont. Just recently, like Amazon merged with Whole Foods. Like there's been so many. Like you can actually. I recommend people do that. Type in just list of multi-billion-dollar mergers since 1995, and like it's crazy just how concentrated everything is getting. And that's typical because like the Jesuits want to further. It was Peter J. Doiswick. He wrote this in 1960. He says international Jesuitry is looking to merge like everything, merging corporations, labor unions, like Protestant denominations, etc. But yeah, but just I don't know. I don't know. I think many Americans are aware, but I don't think they realize like how like they're really living in like an oligopoly. And like that's why you're seeing like more taxes like are being raised to squeeze out small business owners in the United States. Like the farming industry is like we Monsanto, the company Monsanto, if people aren't aware, was founded by a devout Roman Catholic, what was it, John Francis Keeney, founder of Monsanto, devout Catholic, but Monsanto is literally like driven like I don't have the exact number, but like there's been literally like this is documented. There's been thousands of small farmers in the United States that can't farm anymore because of Monsanto's monopoly on seeds. Like farmers like are required to purchase Monsanto seeds. And with like with you know what Monsanto will do is like they'll actually release like bags of their seeds, and like I forget the term of this in farming, but like, the seeds get carried in the wind, and then like the wind carries these seeds hundreds of kilometers, and these seeds fall into the fields of certain farmers, and it actually infects the farmers' own fields. So now so this actually causes farmers to become dependent on Monsanto seeds, and like there's a long history that like a big Jesuit connection to Monsanto. Clarence Thomas, currently in the Supreme Court, was a lawyer at Monsanto in the 70s, and he went to Jesuit Holy Cross. And I'm pretty sure Clarence Thomas actually was the judge actually hearing cases against Monsanto. So like, do you think there's going to be a conflict of interest? But I recommend people like the group Food and Water Watch did a good report on Monsanto, just like a summary of their past, like how they made business making like poisonous PCBs. Like that's how they started back in like the early 20th century, and like they just have like a legacy of death. You know what I mean? Like their history in Vietnam with the Agent Orange, for instance. But I do think like it made Brussels time. The corporate like mammoth wasn't as big as it is now. But she she was warning us of it because like the Reagan administration was the beginning of this. In terms of like corporate power has really been in America since its inception, but in terms of like seeing like military budgets that are like hundreds of billions of dollars, that like the Reagan administration was the beginning of that.
Well, and of course, Reagan was, or how his apologists like to present him or sell him, or rather sell his legacy, is he was one of the key figures in bringing down communism. He killed the USSR, and whether that's true is a different story, but that's the perception. And people said that Ronnie and Margaret Thatcher and John Paul II were like the perfect trifecta. They all worked together to bring down the evil Russian Empire. And no, what it was is the Jesuits who have been orchestrating the whole Cold War, who created manufacturing and control the whole Cold War, said, you know what? It's time to pull the plug on this.
Well, absolutely, and that's why
And
like, the Pope played like the mediator between both sides.
yes,
Just showing you like how controlled like the whole situation was.
well, okay,
Pretty sure
uh,
Gorbachev. I'm pretty sure I read this quote in Paul Williams's book of all sources, but Gorbachev, I'm pretty sure had a quote where he said Pope John the Paul II was like the most like inspirational man or like the most influential man like he's met, something along those lines.
yes.
But Gorbachev was propping up Pope John Paul. That's
Okay. Thank you for bringing up John Paul II. Well, I brought him up. About John Paul II, nee Karol Joseph Cardinal Wojtyla, who prior to becoming the pontiff, he was the Archbishop of Krakow, Poland. Now, I mentioned that last Tuesday, it's still Monday evening here, I'd gone to my alma mater to hear a lecture on the Holocaust. And there was a retired professor from Northwestern, Peter Hayes, who is Irish Roman Catholic, and he talked about the Holocaust. And I spoke with him for maybe 5, 10 minutes after the lecture, and I asked him about paperclip, and he did acknowledge it. And we also talked briefly about Voigtla. Now, it seems as if that he gave me contradictory information. Now, according to Mae Brussel, from a broadcast from November 1978, just after Voigtla became John Paul II, according to a Newsweek article from that time, November 1978, Voigtla worked for IG Farben plant in Krakow.
actually, you know what? I found a source from this time. This was from the United Press International. I've archived this, but it claims that Pope John Paul II worked at Solvay, which was a subsidiary of IG Farben. So like there's multiple like if it's not the exact like, wording like multiple sources. Yeah, so that was Newsweek. Yeah, so Newsweek and UPI both reported that in the
Oh, okay.
80s.
Okay, so anyhow, according to Hayes, that was not according to Brussels and according to Newsweek, IG Farben or its subsidiary, what did you say it was Sorbet?
It was Solvay, Solvay. I think they're still in existence, but yeah, they were a subsidiary. And actually, interesting. I'll let you keep going, George. But Herman Abs also worked at Solvay. Like
Okay.
Herman Abs was like he was like Hitler's paymaster who became the Vatican banker after or Abs became the Vatican banker after the Sindona crisis.
Okay, so that would have been in the 1970s. But anyhow, so according to Hayes, uh, he said there are several countries that have chemical factories in Poland. Um, and according to Hayes, IG Farben or subsidiary, whatever name was, did not manufacture Zyklon B in Krakow. Now, I know this may sound like a trivial point. He said they made it in 3 or 4 different places. One was in Germany, one was in or what used to be Czechoslovakia, and some other places. But he said they did not manufacture, according to Hayes, they did not manufacture, the Nazis did not manufacture Zyklon B in Krakow for IG Farben or any subsidiaries. So anyhow, I get okay. This is where you have a problem where you have to defer to the professionals because Hayes had gone to Europe, he'd been to Germany, he'd been to Poland, he'd been to all the places that the Nazis occupied. He speaks and reads fluent German, and he was able to look at the records. So I just simply had to take him on his word that he was telling the truth. Now, he said he had never heard this allegation before about Wojtyla, the future John Paul II. Now, to me, somebody who's a professor, somebody who has a PhD, and who for 20, 30 years taught seminars on the Holocaust.
Well, I'm just saying, like this, the only source that I've seen this accusation made was from I think Bill Cooper's book, Behind a Pale Horse, and I was saying that book like has been like it doesn't have like a great reputation. I think as a book, like I think quote unquote academics like would more like tend to mock that Bill Cooper book than actually like take it seriously. But
Okay.
I don't think any like mainstream, just yeah, no really mainstream, historian or academic publications have brought up that story with Wojtyla.
Okay. Now, as I mentioned on the broadcast last year, this was like 6 months ago, 8 months ago, that there's a YouTube video with Timothy Michael Cardinal Dolan, the current Archbishop of New York, who has officiated the last two presidential Smith dinner. He said point blank, he was giving a talk on the popes of the 21st century. So that would have been Francis, me, Jorge Mario Cardinal Bergoglio, Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, and the aforementioned John Paul II, aka Wojtyla, Colonel Wojtyla. Um, and he was talking when Dolan was talking about the young Wojtyla. He said that he was born in Poland in 1920. I forgot how you pronounce the name of the place, but he grew up near Krakow. And that's where he ultimately became a priest there and became a prelate. Well, one of the things that Dolan mentioned in passing was that during the war, i.e., World War II, he he worked at a chemical. He had a night job working at a chemical company in Krakow. He did not identify it as being R.J. Farben or Soil or Soyal or however you say it. But I'd imagine that there wouldn't have been that many chemical companies in Krakow at that time. And also, Dolan never said exactly what Voigtla did. It's possible that he was just simply, a janitor or something like that, or he could have been a lab tech. But that would at least partially verify what.
Actually, the like I have the article up here. I pulled it up from the United Press from 1983. It says this at near the end of the article. It's talking about maybe we'll have to find. It's talking about a biography that was written on John Paul II. But it says here the biography, which includes a foreword by the Archbishop of Philadelphia, Cardinal John Crowell, said the Pope, quote, spent 8 hours a day breaking up stones out of doors, even in the bitterest cold, at the Solvay quarry. And then this article claims that he was working at it was called the Solvay mining subsidiary. And then it says interestingly, it says like while the Pope was working there, Herman Abs was working there also. What does it say here? It says the book here is called John Paul II: A Pictorial Biography, published by McGraw-Hill, an establishment publisher. But apparently, in this official biography by John Paul, they even brought up that he was working at a plant in Poland.
Okay.
And there's another source for that. This source isn't specific. But Avro Manhattan also mentions that he was working at a source at a factory in Poland. So I think it's undeniable he was working at and if it doesn't really matter if it was Solvay or IG Farben, because Solvay was a subsidiary of IG Farben.
Okay.
So either way, he was working at the company there was no Hitler's Germany without IG Farben. Well, there's no there's no Hitler's Germany without Standard Oil, General Electric, Ford, General Motors, DuPont. But in particular, IG Farben, it was the Nazi military machine in terms of getting their gasoline running, the rubber, the poison gases, the military machine, in combination with Krupp. And that's why you saw Krupp was slapped on the Time magazine cover in 1957. But you just see it's just more connections from the Vatican to the Nazis. And you saw another Pope, Ratzinger, was a Hitler Youth.
Yes.
Right after.
As was his older brother Georg. The future Pope Benedict XVI, his Joseph Ratzinger, and his older brother Georg, they're Hitler Youth. And this, I actually read about this in a mainstream source. This is actually my local paper. And looking back at it, that seems shocking because I thought that would have moved heaven and earth to try to hide that fact. But they tried to spin it to where, well, the Ratzingers were draftees and they didn't really have a choice. They said either you fight for us or we'll shoot you. Well, okay. this is something people may not know. I'm not an expert on Nazi Germany, but there's different types of services.
I'm saying like that maybe that apologist line might work if the Vatican didn't smuggle so many Nazis out of Europe and like disguise them as priests, like Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie, William Schreiber, Otto von Bolschwing, etc.
Well, okay, in all fairness to the Ratzinger boys, they were just teenagers, so they're just like they weren't high level figures. Now, there's pictures which you can see online where you had the young Ratzinger, the future Benedict XVI, giving a Nazi salute, and he's in his black uniform with his eagle and all that sort of stuff. Now, people don't realize this, but there's different types of services people could have gone into. You had the Wehrmacht, which was the regular army, and you had the Luftwaffe, the Air Force. But the Hitler Youth, that was volunteer. You weren't drafted into that, and they did have like a people's army, Volkswehrmacht. They had the Jugendwehrmacht, for the kids. Um, but as I said, the Ratzingers volunteered for the Hitler Youth, and they're in it for Josef Ratzinger was in it for something like 4 years.
Do you know if the family, like, do they come from like a aristocratic, like high moneyed family?
I'm not sure. They were from Bavaria, which was
Because I'm just saying okay, well the interesting it just so happens to be a coincidence that not the the Nazi party started in Bavaria, which was known as like the most Catholic part of the European continent.
well.
No, I'm just saying that because historically, like the Vatican has historically allied themselves with like the most reactionary people in society, like the aristocrats, like the landowners, like the people that are more like the people that have an active interest in seeing like the status quo maintained. And I assume like if the people don't become popes from like poor families, so I just assume the Ratzinger family is probably like I assume they were probably aristocrats, just like the Weissackers, who has and Weissacker was the Nazi ambassador to the Vatican. But like he came from like a 100-year aristocratic family, like that like the Weissackers had like prominence in Europe or in Germany since like 1750.
Well, the just to get back to Wojtyla, his background was military. His dad was, I guess, a colonel in the Polish army, and the Wojtylas were old friends with the Brzezinski family. Thaddeus Brzezinski, the father of Zbigniew and the grandfather of Mika, was a Polish diplomat. He was. I'm only vaguely familiar with this history, but as I said, the Wojtylas and the Rutschinskis went way back to at least the 19th century. So they were very familiar with each other. And of course,
oh, fascinating information. I knew Zbigniew was friends with the Pope. Yeah, I didn't know like the connection goes like generations down. Oh, that's fascinating.
And of course, you've talked about Zbigniew and you've talked about his daughter Mika. Just as a reminder for those who may have missed it, didn't you say that Mika did one of the first broadcasts on 9/11?
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure it was the first official report on 9/11. Yeah, that was Mika Brzezinski. Yeah.
And of course, her dad Zbigniew back in the late 1970s, and I actually found this out from James Corbett for what it's worth, that he basically created the organization that would become Al Qaeda. They call it I believe they call it Hezbollah in the 1970s, and so so there's actually video footage of Zbigniew Brzezinski in Afghanistan meeting with some of the figure who will later be known as Osama bin Laden. Now, there's a
there's that supposed picture with him and bin Laden. Like even if I've seen that photo, but even if that isn't bin Laden, I think it's doubtless that he would have like bin Laden has been documented to have been like an FBI agent and like a CIA agent as early as like 1997. And just I'm pretty sure, like Hezbollah was another force that was financed by the West, but I think in particular with Brzezinski, it was the Mujahideen that he was directly connected with. And that was the Brzezinski. Like I'm pretty sure he was the chairman of the Trilateral Commission for like 15 years, as well. like on top of being like Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. You know, people just aren't aware, but like, it's just this knowledge, you know, needs to become common knowledge. But Brzezinski was educated by the Jesuits in Montreal at Loyola High School, and
And his
Brzezinski also he was a lifetime member at the Center for Strategic Institute of the Center. No, this abbreviation's a mouthful. The CSIS think tank at Georgetown. The SCSIS military think tank. Brzezinski was like a member there for like 25 years. But just people need to realize like all these war hawks connect back to the Jesuits in some way. Like Henry Kissinger was a professor at Georgetown University, and Kissinger, like the war hawk Brzezinski, you know, was a lifetime member at CSIS, still is
Mhm.
at Georgetown.
Well, you know, it's
And this
funny.
was,
I
you know,
first
we
became
connect back to Mae Brussel. I recommend Mae Brussel, like in particular, like she has great information on like Alexander Haig and like Vernon Walters, like two of the biggest like war hawks in like American history, and like both Haig and Walters were Knights of Malta and trained by the Jesuits.
oh,
Like
okay.
like Walters was at the Vatican as early as like 1948. You know, working in like the Truman administration. But you know, Walters was like an advisor to like 6 or 7 presidents. He was known as Reagan's like roving ambassador. Like Walters, just he was right. He was in Brazil right before the coup d'état there in 1964, and he was in Fiji before the coup there in 84. Walters was all over the place. Like Mae Brussel like read some excerpts out of his book, and even Francis Rooney in his book, The Global Vatican, quoted some out of Walters' autobiography. But Walters like he met John Paul II like over 12 times, and he writes about how like when Vernon Walters like would meet the Pope, like the Pope would get everyone out of the room, or just get like a one-on-one with him and Vernon Walters. You know, Alexander Haig, it was identical. Like Alexander Haig like supported like every single dictator regime that was backed by the United States. Like Alexander Haig was you know, like supporting the dictatorship in Vietnam, supporting the dictatorship in like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Brazil, Argentina. Yeah, and just people. Mae Brussel, like these Knights of Malta generals. You know, like we're still feeling the effect of that today. Like the current generals that are in charge of the U.S., like nothing's changed. Like James Mattis, current Secretary of Defense, devout Roman Catholic, wants the $750 billion budget for the military,
Mhm.
for instance. And like the Mae Brussel, like she had great information. Like all these players I just talked about were very key in the Augusto Pinochet coup in Chile in 1973. And I just mentioned that because if you didn't see this recent headline, George, Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State who used to work for Exxon, the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was a high-up executive at Exxon. But one of the biggest oil companies in the world, Rex Tillerson has said that the U.S. needs to invade Venezuela in a Pinochet-style type coup. That was
Okay.
like 2 weeks ago. But
Well,
I
speak.
recommend but like all these war hawks in the U.S. Army. You know, they connect back to Jesuit schools or like Knights of Malta, and like Mae Brussel, was on that back in the 80s.
Well, you know, just a couple of responses. You just referenced the Chilean coup of the early 1970s. Well, that was on September the 11th, 1973. Um, hmm. And I'm sure they just picked
Well,
that
actually, George,
date.
another interesting, great point, George. Another interesting September 11th I found was the Jesuit retreat house in New York, Manresa, opened September 11th, 1911,
Mhm.
or 1921. But yeah, like 9/11, but I just think that's interesting how like that retreat house was September
Well,
11th.
well, you know, it's funny that you're talking about Mae Brussel and Alexander Haig. I listened to one of her tapes or one of her broadcasts on Haig, and you could say that Haig got the Eisenhower treatment. That it was as if he had both Eisenhower and Haig had guardian angels who were looking out for them, because Haig, I guess, was a good student at West Point, but he had somebody looking out for him who fast tracked him. You had a whole, but you know, Johnny probably would be more qualified to talk about this than myself. But they said if you're like a golden child, they say, you know what, you're going somewhere. You're going to be the supreme allied commander. You're going to be Secretary of State. You're going to be President of the United States. We'll make sure that you bypass
Pretty sure he was in the
all the other.
he was in the Nixon administration too. I think he was like chief of staff or something like that. If not
Yes.
that, if not
So
that, but he was in the Nixon's, and like he had a Jesuit priest as his brother.
yes,
So I'm
Francis.
sure. So I'm sure the Jesuits like that they can pass him information right from his brother. Sorry, keep going.
Okay, so there are certain figures that, for whatever, even though they may not be the most competent, and there may be other figures who are way more qualified, more experienced. You pass if you're like an Alexander Haig or if you're Dwight Eisenhower, you can bypass all the other candidates and make rank and get into major positions of authority. Right, you can become something like NATO commander. You can become chief of staff to another general or something along those lines. And even though you may not be the best, you may not be the brightest. Now, something that just came up, there was a scandal that came out or occurred, I guess, last month or so, that you've had these celebrities who are able to pull strings to get their children into top notch schools. And I know we've talked about this, like Georgetown, like Stanford, like Villanova. Well, this has been going on for basically forever. If you have the right background, if your dad is a senator, if your dad is the ambassador to the UK or something,
Well,
you're
you examine
you're
Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for instance, and Henry Cabot Lodge, a famous like Henry Cabot Lodge like famously like served the banks very loyally. So that's probably why Henry Cabot
yes.
Lodge Jr. is so prominent.
And of course, more recently you can talk about George W. Bush. I mean, he was a mediocre student at best, but his dad, George H.W. Bush, and his grandfather, Prescott Bush, were both skull and bonesmen. And of course, W was a skull and bonesman. So that was his key. That was his ticket to success.
Oh, absolutely, and even probably like George Herbert Walker was trained by the Jesuits. I don't know if he was Skull and Bones also,
Mhm.
but and yeah, I thought that was incredible. Like it ended up being Donald Trump, but if Jeb Bush was the Republican candidate, that would have been like a 30th straight year with a Bush running in the Republican Party. I don't think Jeb Bush is done. I think it's possible there could be another Bush in the White House. And Jeb
Oh,
Bush is a fourth degree Knight of Columbus. If people aren't
mhm.
aware, the New York Times even did an article. I have it on my page. It was like Jeb Bush, uh, in his conversion to Catholicism. So that was the title. If type in Jeb Bush Catholicism New York Times, you'll see the article.
And of course, speaking of, I know we're bouncing around, but there's a curtain psyop right now about Joe Biden, creepy Uncle Joe, because he's supposed to. Uh, there's videos that have been out there for years about Joe Biden, about him touching people, touching uh, teenage girls or prepubescent girls in somewhat inappropriate manner, like putting his hands around their shoulders, stroking their hair, or even doing this to adult women, married women. Um, and it's not something that just happened once, but it's happened dozens of times over years to various different figures. And I'm not sure why I'm bringing this up, but Joe Biden was. This is what something that Johnny speculates, and I tend to agree with this. He was actually you could say the real president when Obama was in office. Barack Obama was just basically an empty suit who gave speeches and signed executive orders. That's all he did for 8 years. It was actually, in his opinion, and as I said, I happen to believe that Biden was the one who was calling the shots. Well, actually, some Jesuit behind Biden, but anyhow, so
Well, I
there,
think I
there
would
was,
agree with that. Well, like, do you think it's part of like a side because like the people who are gaslighting kind of Biden, like all these guys, all these elitists, probably like a good many of them, like are like very sexually deviant. But I find just with these Joe Biden like gaslighters is that they just gaslight him, showing like touching the kids, and there's no relevant geopolitical background to anything, and it just ends up being like kind of like a satanic panic at the end of the day.
Okay, I'm not sure if I get your point.
Well, I'm saying like people like I see like most videos that are exposing like so-called like child pedophilia online like are just very I don't know like very dogmatic, um, very just there's no political background to any of the discussion. I just seen that with Joe Biden, but I personally do think Joe Biden is probably a pedophile. Like like the videos are creepy, but I think I don't necessarily if it is a psyop, it would be a psyop because they're not telling you how connected Joe Biden is to like the Roman Empire.
Well, of course. I mean, we could. I think you've done a video on Joe Biden, and we could probably do a segment on him. But he, something Johnny has brought up. He has at least two honor degrees, one from Scranton and one from St. Joseph's. So his claim to fame is, I believe, he was supposed to be the first openly Roman Catholic vice president the United States has ever had. Um,
Actually, just quickly,
so
his son Hunter Biden even went did like a volunteer corps with the Jesuits down in
okay,
South America.
so anyhow, unless Joe Biden has done anything, has got out of line, nothing's going to happen to him. Now, these videos of him like stroking these little girls' hair and things like that, it's uncomfortable, but not necessarily illegal or immoral. So, but we're probably just okay. We probably have no idea what he's done or what he and the other elites have done, and it's probably. I'm just speculating. I don't mean to cast aspersions unnecessarily, but it's probably far more egregious. I mean, something that Johnny has said before, and I don't mean to sound as if I'm idolizing him, because however, I do agree with him most of the time, is in order to get to a position of prominence in the world, whether you're talking about Canada or the U.S. or whatever, federal, state, or local level or provincial level up in Canada, usually one of three things have to apply. You have to be corrupt, controlled, or compromised. Now, there have been a few exceptions here and there. Now, if you take Joe Biden, who was the vice president, and I believe he was the senator from Delaware, I want to say that before he became vice president. And
Yeah, it was
so
from
he's Roman
Delaware.
Catholic. Oh, okay. Okay. His for instance, he's a Roman Catholic, and as I said, he has at least a couple of honorary degrees from SJ institutions. So of course, he's controlled and he's compromised, but we have no idea what he's done in his private life. We don't know what his handlers could use what he's done to be black, to say to keep in line. Say, hey, we don't. Hey, Joe, you better, when you're in the Senate, you better support this bill because you don't want these compromising photographs to come out of you. You don't want these things to leak to the press. And I'm sure that's what happens, to people like the late John McCain, things like that. This is pure speculation.
Yeah,
Because
that could be that stuff could have been leaked, by the powers that be themselves, like, as like a warning to Joe Biden. Also, that's very possible.
okay, and of course, I mean, I just mentioned John, the late John.
I think you're under. I think no doubt though, like politicians, have it's come out full circle in the open. Like even on like the show, The House of Cards, like they have a clip of Frank Underwood going to like the Bohemian Grove. Like he basically says that like this is where all like the world's like richest men like go around run around in the woods and stuff like. It was essentially like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was asked about the Bohemian Club. He said, "Yeah, that's where all the rich Republicans go run around naked in the woods." So like it's coming out like right in the open now that this stuff happens. And that was the show House of Cards, for instance. Like we saw that, in the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, all that, all those allegations that came up.
Well,
So, a lot of these guys do compromising stuff. So, but like in terms so like I think Joe Biden, undoubtedly has done some shady stuff. I just think I just haven't seen any of the people who are making those videos on him like make the connection that Joe Biden is devout Roman Catholic. He's serving the papacy. Um, every move that he's done has also benefited like massive corporations as well. When you start to look into it.
Oh, okay. And something I want to mention to shift gears. Speaking of politicians, couple of this last election here in the U.S., several new politicians took office in the U.S. House of Representatives, like 3 or 4 big ones. Um, One name we've discussed before is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. And I just found this out about when she was a bartender, she went by Sandy. But I guess her handler said, you know what, it sounds more professional if you went by your given name, Alexandria. And but that's besides the point. So we've talked about her before, the fact that she's Puerto Rican and she's Roman Catholic. And she allegedly has a degree in economics from Boston University. Boston University, not Boston College, but it's close enough. We've discussed Ilhan Omar, the representative from the Twin Cities, who was born in Mogadishu, Somalia, and she's part of the, uh, I guess,
Actually, I've
substantial
noticed
Somali.
all the controlled opposition shills like reveal themselves when they start defending Ibn Omar. Like, oh, she's trying to tell us the truth about the Zionist Israeli influence that's controlling America. Blah 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 blah. But like I'm saying, a lot of talking pundits are defending Ibn Omar. She's the classic, Jesuit rabble rouser. She came out of like literally out of nowhere.
Well,
Started,
yes.
speaking, Jesuit anti-Semitic propaganda from like talking points from like the Civica Catholica magazine. That's what all like the modern day anti-Semitism really is. But
Well, just about a year ago, in February of 2018, I may have mentioned this in the show before. She spoke at a Catholic church in the Twin Cities, St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church, on a Sunday. And I say on a Sunday because I guess I saw the bulletin article, and this is supposed to be before the regular Mass. And there's a video of her talking, and I'm not sure what she discussed because it wasn't interested. I was only interested in the fact that she actually spoke at a Catholic church. This woman who's supposed to be a Muslim, I believe a Sunni Muslim, why in the world would she be speaking at such an institution?
well, like
It
the
reminded
devout
me of,
Nancy Pelosi, like as cat, like Pelosi's been one of her like biggest champions in the Democratic Party.
well, yes.
Pelosi's like as much of a papist as it gets. So that's that just shows you if she's getting the backing of Pelosi, like something's going on.
Okay, well, that reminded me of a video you did last year on Louis Farrakhan, the fact that he spoke at a Catholic church, I guess a few years ago in New York City. Well, it wasn't St. Patrick's Cathedral, but it was like one of those. It was a major Catholic congregation, and he just I mean, it's just like everything he says is Jew, 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 Jew.
Yeah, he called them
It's like,
the wicked satanic Jews.
yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
really getting spoon fed that from his Jesuit man.
I mean, the first thing he says when he wakes up in the morning is the dirty Jews. And remind me of that. So I decided to look into these other figures. There's one named Presley. I've not looked into her, um, but then there's another one who's from Michigan, Detroit. Was it Talib? Was it, yeah, Rashida Tlaib? She was supposed to have been a Palestinian, or I believe she was born in Palestine, Israel. And sure enough, last year she gave a talk at Detroit Mercy University in Motown at the behest of Amar. Zar. Now, Amar Zar is a Jordanian. Well, he's Jordanian Palestinian, and he's Muslim, and he's a law professor at Detroit Mercy. And so last year, I guess I don't know when, but before the election, he actually asked her to speak. So there again, Rashida Tlaib is, I guess she's a Sunni Muslim from Palestine. So you had all these Muslims speaking at either Catholic churches or Catholic schools, giving their talks. And now, Tlaib isn't quite as obnoxious as Omar. And in all fairness to Omar, it's probably she's the posts that she's made on social media, like Twitter and so forth, are probably not hers. She has one of her staff members writing that stuff. And whenever she asks people questions in Congress, she almost certainly has somebody spoon feeding it to her. Because you can see here, there's YouTube videos of her talking to people in Congress, and she appears to be reading something from a script uh, off of her laptop. So I think I mentioned this before. Um, Omar, Tlaib, Presley, they're part of these young Turk type Democrats. And I say that young Turks because they're new and they're actually being pushed by the online program, the Young Turks, by Cirque Uric or whatever his name, however you pronounce his name.
Oh, yeah,
And
I'm convinced that there's a CIA contract going on with him, Cenk Uygur.
yes, I was
Yeah,
like,
he's promoting like the Donald Trump's like an agent of Russia stuff
okay.
for president.
So
But yeah, he actually I found a direct Jesuit. There was I can pull it up here on the uh while you're talking. Just but I found a columnist who was or like, this girl did the show on the Young Turks till 2015. But I found someone who's employed by the Young Turks who went to Loyola University. Yeah, so, but I noticed
yes, and
all these Democrats, like, are actually like preaching like a police state. Like
yeah.
when you think about it, most
So
of them are like pro-war. Most of the Democratic Party is pro-war, which is interesting. Like Bernie Sanders, um, what was he? Even like I saw this. Bernie Sanders was jumping on like the RussiaGate conspiracy theory.
mhm.
Just for instance. So like I think personally like this is setting up for like Donald Trump's going to be reelected because during the election campaign like this RussiaGate conspiracy that's been pushed by like the communist the left has turned into a communist left in the United States. It's not a genuine liberal movement anymore. Like what what's being pushed by the left, like Donald Trump is going to be able to run on re-election saying that I've been a victim of a witch hunt by like he can say like I've been a victim of a witch hunt of like the deep state like liberal media. And I'm saying like, and people are gonna rally behind that. Like I even saw like the USA Today did a poll, like half of the country thinks Trump's been a victim of a witch hunt, for instance. So I think possibly the self sabotage that the Democratic Party is being done to put Trump back in office because Trump has literally built up the police state and like set record military budgets. He's about to like invade Venezuela. Like Trump's on board. Like Lockheed Martin just gave Saudi Arabia like a new it's called the THAAD missile defense system. It's being installed in Saudi Arabia on behalf of Lockheed Martin, who got like a $50 billion tax payout this year from the Trump administration.
Mhm.
So I just think the way that we've seen like the Democrats like self sabotage, like it's setting up possibly for a Trump re-election because like I just think he's gonna run. Trump's not an idiot. He's gonna run on the fact that he's been a victim of like this Russia witch hunt that like hasn't gone anywhere. And like for example, like I knew like the FBI director Mueller, who has started this investigation. Like you can see a clip of him. Like he was testifying to Congress in 2004 that Saddam Hussein 100% had nuclear weapons, like weapons of mass destruction. So he has no credibility. Like I've seen a photo of Robert Mueller at Fordham University in 2011 when the FBI, while he was director, had like an annual. They had their annual cybersecurity conference at the Jesuit school, and Mueller's seen with like he's seen in that article, like I have it archived on the FBI. He's seen with Jesuit priests and Fordham trustees. You know what I mean? So obviously, like the whole investigation, I think, was like a political ploy to get Donald Trump more reelectable for the American electorate. And for example, like Bernie Sanders, I don't think like I don't think he's like he's a complete puppet himself. You know, like Bernie Sanders has gone to the Vatican. Bernie Sanders, like when it really comes down to it, isn't going to do anything. He's just a puppet. And that's why you saw recently Bernie Sanders jump on the Russiagate conspiracy theory, because he's really just a puppet. He's not a real opposition to Donald Trump.
Well, you know, his wife is Roman Catholic, and of course, according to Eric John Phelps, I always cringe when I say that. Sanders is a Freemason. I'm not sure how and that would make sense because
George, actually on Bernie Sanders, there's a channel. This was remind me. This was the channel Veritas Equitas. He did a YouTube video on this, but he actually found a clip of Bernie Sanders praising certain Jesuits. This was like Bernie Sanders in like the 1980s. But Bernie Sanders is literally praising Jesuits, like in the video, like the Jesuits in like El Salvador, I think. Yeah, and like for instance, like in his state, Vermont, like Bernie Sanders' fellow senator in Vermont, Patrick Leahy, is the longest serving like senator in the U.S. Senate, and he was double dipped Jesuit trained, devout Roman Catholic.
Okay. Yes. Leahy went to Georgetown, and he went to a school in Vermont, St. Thomas or something. I had to go look it up. And of course, with the Kavanaugh hearings, what 6 months ago? There are two phases. There was essentially Kavanaugh versus Leahy, which is basically Jesuitical theater. Then the second phase is you had other politicians questioning him, like Kamala Harris, the junior senator from California. But then you had the senior senator from California, Dianne Feinstein, who brought in this.
Actually, just quickly on George, she was the victim of a kind of a Catholic witch hunt recently. I'll actually, while you're talking, I'll pull this up. There's like Roman Catholic Knights of Columbus woman being sworn in, and Dianne Feinstein said something along the lines like, "The dogma clearly like lived strong with you."
Oh, are you talking about the judge?
Like that? Who was that?
Amy. She was I believe at the time a law professor at Notre Dame, and she was a candidate. Trump had nominated her, I believe, for the 7th Court in Chicago. And at her confirmation hearing, this was from a couple of years ago, at the confirmation hearing.
I came on this late, but I just saw articles from the Washington Post. Like, they're hilarious. Like, they were saying, like, Dianne Feinstein should be ashamed of herself. She should apologize for displaying such anti-Catholic bigotry and shamefulness. Like, it was really pathetic. Like the apologetic level that these mainstream, like, it was literally all over the place. Like I saw like 5 different sources were calling Dianne Feinstein like an anti-Catholic bigot. You know, she was educated by the Catholics herself, but she just said like the dogma lives strongly with you. Like, that should show you like the power of like the Catholic Church. Like, holy cow. And it's a legitimate, like it's amazing. Like it should be a legitimate concern that like someone like the lady who's being sworn in was also a Knight of Columbus. Like, if you're that, or if she was just Catholic, but like just in general, like if you're a member of like the most authoritarian, totalitarian church in the world that does not believe in separation of church and state, that should be a question when you're taking an oath to defend a democracy that says that there is a separation of church and state. Like, that's not religious bigotry. That's just, fundamental constitutional rights. So like they never, the apologists don't say that. If you're not aware of that, Feinstein was kind of like just a victim of like a media witch hunt herself, which I thought was kind of amusing.
Well, okay, there's a couple of ways of taking that. Comey Barrett was on is now on the 7th Court. Now there's talk of Trump nominating here for the court when Ruth Bader Ginsburg does eventually turn into dust, which will be probably soon. And they thought there's speculation that he was actually Trump would have nominated her sooner. He was actually Comey Barrett was actually Trump's second choice. His first choice for the Supreme Court was Gorsuch. His second choice was Amy Coney Barrett, but he decided to go with Kavanaugh for whatever reason. Now, it's probably pretty much a fake, I believe, that he will nominate Coney Barrett when Ruth Bader Ginsburg does eventually dies, which is, as I said, it was going to be probably sooner than later. And by the way, I've said this before, and just in case anybody misses, her husband or her late husband, Martin Ginsburg, was a full-on law professor at Georgetown. And I know I mentioned this on the show last year when Anthony Scalia died just over 3 years ago, or however it is he died. That's another conversation altogether. One of the things that then President Obama, Barack Obama, mentioned when he was talking about Scalia's death was, he talked about his background, where he grew up, where he went to school, all that sort of stuff. And he said that Anthony Scalia, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, despite their philosophical differences on almost everything, they managed to set aside their differences on a regular basis to go to the New York Metropolitan Opera, as they went with their respective spouses. And
where your neighborhood aristocrats all hang out.
Well, yes. So even though they're bitter enemies, in chambers, they're good friends outside of chambers. So, as I said, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's husband, Martin, was a professor at Georgetown, a full professor with tenure. And Nina.
George just said another great, because Ginsburg is another case where people will be like, oh, look, a Jew, Ginsburg, the Jews are controlling the Supreme Court. And then she has a husband that's a professor at Georgetown. Another case of that was Janet Yellen, who's the Jew who was recently head of the Fed. She had a husband who was also like a tenured professor at Georgetown, Daniel Aklarov. But I saw tons of propaganda saying, "Oh, look, Janet Yellen's a Jew. Janet Yellen's a Jew. The Protocols of Zion, blah 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 blah." But you see all these key, that's those are two powerful examples. Ginsburg and Yellen have two husbands that are literally tenured professors at Georgetown.
Oh, okay. So that's how you kiss the papal ring. Now, speaking of Hegelian dialectic, we actually had not mentioned that phrase, but we implied it. You're talking about the left and the right, or the left and the pseudo right, the so-called conservatives versus the so-called liberals, and I say liberal in the modern bastardized sense. I listen to local radio. Well, actually, nationally syndicated radio, and I like listening to the left hosts, and they're only a couple now. There's Stephanie Miller and Tom Hartman. There was somebody who was on the radio until about a month or so ago named Norm Goldman. Goldman, as you can probably glean, is of Jewish background, and as I said before, he got his law degree from Loyola Marymount. And you can check off on almost all the left, all left views that he had, abortion, gun control, homosexuality, you name it, he supports it. Now, I've mentioned Stephanie Miller before, who is a comedian and actress, and she does a nationally syndicated radio talk show host. She is the daughter of William Edward Miller Sr. And I know I brought this before. Miller was a representative from New York State, and in 1964, he was Barry Goldwater's running mate. So her dad, Bill Miller, was supposed to be a staunch conservative Republican. And his daughter, Stephanie, is a staunch leftist. Well, and she's a homosexual for good measure. Well, something I was going to mention is that there's another figure named Tom Hartman. He's like, he's about as, he's, okay.
Actually, Yeah, I'm aware of Tom Hartman. I don't know. I haven't seen nearly like his whole body of work, but I know he did a decent. I think it's still on YouTube. But I watched the show he did this when Dow and DuPont merged.
Okay,
It was decent, but
well, and I'm not saying he or the others don't make valid points. I happen to agree with him on many of his criticisms of Reagan. Now, having said that, back in 1998, Tom Hartman and his wife Louise went to the Vatican and they met with John Paul II. And
oh
I
wow.
think
Well, you know,
I
I
think
think I always knew, he was probably a gatekeeper. Yeah, he went to the Vatican. Wow, jeez.
so. Not only did they meet the pontiff, but they're both dressed in black, and they're very. Even though Hartman's background is nominally Protestant, but if you listen to anything he says, he's like anti-Protestant. I mean, he's criticized, he's criticized capitalism. He's criticized the Second Amendment. He's criticized uh, the Calvinism, Puritanism. He said he's ashamed of being white because it was basically the white man that had basically destroyed this country, i.e., America, and other countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, uh, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And he, whenever people will
Well,
pose
I'm saying
questions,
clearly, if he's doing all this, then like, he's clearly a disinformation agent. He has an agenda.
of course, I've heard people brought this up both on his show and on the Stephanie Miller show. Hey, is it possible? People will phone in and say, "Hey, is it possible what just happened in New Zealand a few weeks ago was a false flag?" And immediately, although Miller or Hartman would immediately dismiss him and said, "Are you some sort of right wing, white nationalist wacko? You've been listening to too much Alex Jones." What do you mean false flags? Those that don't exist. And so, of course,
No, we're seeing all the
well,
mainstream media pundits like starting to ally themselves with like the CIA global propaganda line. Just mentioned like Bill Maher. I covered this. Like Bill Maher was saying, "You're an idiot if you don't support John Brennan."
okay.
John
So
Brennan, like like literally the messiah of like the national security state. You know what I mean?
well, okay. Well, which reminds me of another point. Some of these terms, this lingo I mean, some of these terms are leaking out to the general public and into the mainstream media, such as false flag. But I guess they did that. The so-called deep state, the machine allow that to happen so they can get in front of it. So if you're one of these people who uses the expression such as false flag or black ops or some sort of variation, you're obviously a wacko, because you obviously listen to programs like Alex Jones and all he's like one of the only people who actually uses the term false flag. And yes, I mean I used to listen to his show and
Was it like?
it
Has
was
Tom
actually
Hartman been promoting the Russia conspiracy? Because like all these mainstream media pundits,
oh
they've literally been promoting a conspiracy theory for like 3 years that Trump is literally like Putin's puppet in the White House. Like no evidence behind
well
it.
yeah.
They're literally like, by definition a conspiracy theorist, and then they'll call anyone who doesn't believe in their conspiracy a conspiracy theorist.
Well, yes, of course. Now, I will say this: Donald Trump is a puppet of a foreign agent, of a European foreign agent. I'll say that.
Absolutely, and that's part of like the amazing hypocrisy. There's like Donald Trump is serving an alien power. Like he is, but like the Vatican is by definition like a sovereign country. Like the Vatican has their own like police force, for instance.
And of course,
Coast Guard.
and to be honest and to be fair, but so is Vladimir Putin. So was Obama was when he's in office. So is Justin Trudeau. So was Brian Mulroney. So was um, Brian or Stephen Harper. Sorry, I'm not as up on my prime ministers as I should be, but so is this girl or this woman in New Zealand, Jacinta Ardern. So was Angela Merkel. So was Theresa May. Definitely Tony Blair. So was David Cameron. So was Benjamin Netanyahu. So was Maduro, and I guess was it Chavez before that. So was Fidel Castro when he was alive. I mean, almost all the leaders of the world are puppets of the Vatican, even those who don't profess
Although
to.
interestingly, I found with Chavez, I found some interesting. He was when he was a boy, he was a I think he grew up like a young altar boy. But
Oh,
Chavez, there was a proposed coup to take him out actually in 2002. Actually, I have an article up here on my. Let me pull this up here. I confirm this. Like this was through the WikiLeaks revelations that came out in 2012. But it came out. This is an article called "Priests, Plots, and Hugo Chavez." Does WikiLeaks cables have revealed that Catholic bishops played a key role in 2002's abortive military coup in Venezuela? And this, I'll summarize the article, but like the key plotter for the Vatican was this in the coup to take out Chavez in 2002. And the reason this, like the Vatican, this was a joint, Vatican U.S. foreign policy coup. Like Chavez, I don't agree with the mechanism. Like he's kind of too Marxist for my likings, but Chavez did nationalize Venezuela's oil fields, and Venezuela has twice as many reserves as Saudi Arabia. So for like in terms of like American oil companies in the Vatican, that those are immense assets that they want to get their hands on. But it says here like the cables reveal, it's from the Guardian. The cables reveal from WikiLeaks that Cardinal Antonio Ignacio Velasco, the Salesian Archbishop of Caracas, was on hand to sign papers purporting to legitimize the ridiculous Carmona as he dismissed the Congress and the judges and briefly sent Venezuelan politics back into the dark ages. And this guy here, Pedro Carmona, was the puppet who took over Venezuela briefly for 48 hours. It's just interesting, and just because, I think just with the current coup, the way it's going out, I think it's going to end up Pope Francis is going to play the mediator between both sides. Because he sent even when Maduro was there's an article on this when Maduro was being sworn in, Pope Francis sent his own private representative to Maduro's ceremony. And so while Pope Francis is doing that, like recently the Venezuelan Catholic bishops have made a statement saying that his government is legitimate and they want Juan Guaido back in power in Venezuela. So I think the Vatican is going to play mediator. They're going to make a deal I think Russia will only back out because it's intensifying right now just because Russia is backing the regime of Maduro, and they've actually sent some troops over there recently. But I think if the Vatican is the one to propose a deal to Russia, Russia will back off if the Vatican tells them to back off. And then I think Pope Francis playing the mediator, there'll be a new government installed in Venezuela that's friendly to the Catholic Church. That's ultimately what's going to happen. I think we'll have to see if it plays out like that. But like if just Hugo Chavez, I don't know. Have you seen his speech at the United Nations? He did a speech in 2006. He called George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. It's quite the speech. It's still on YouTube. And I was reading some of the WikiLeaks cables. I think Chavez became more anti-Catholic as his regime progressed because he saw that the Catholic Church was consistently allying itself with the rich reactionary elements of Venezuelan society. But according to WikiLeaks, in one cable, Hugo Chavez said the Catholic Church is a cancer on Venezuela.
Well, speaking of which, funny you should say that because are you saying they probably cancered him?
I think that's he died at he was only 58 years old. He was relatively young. I think it's very possible. I have to look more into his death. I think no doubt, they have a direct influence. The key to Venezuela is the world's largest oil reserves, and they're currently off limits for American and British petroleum companies.
So
Rex Tillerson, this is incredible. The former Secretary of State is the CEO, was literally the former CEO of Exxon. Exxon is one of these companies that directly wants the Venezuelan oil. That's why you see Rex Tillerson advocating for a military invasion in Venezuela.
Okay. So if you're a puppet and you get out of line, they have a myriad of ways of dealing with you. One, they can just simply shoot you in broad daylight, vis-a-vis JFK or Martin Luther King, or they can suicide you, they can cancer you, they can heart attack you, and so it just depends on how visible you are, how important you are, things like that. And it's just like
Oh, and I
you have
think
to.
just down in Venezuela, I'm sure Nicolas Maduro knows that Chavez's death was probably accelerated, and that's why I think he's probably going to make the deal with Pope Francis to mediate both sides of this situation.
And
Because
of course, you have to.
I just think Pope Francis wouldn't have sent a personal representative to his inauguration if something like that isn't in the making right now.
And of course, you have to wonder how many of these people died. These famous figures who are supposed to have died of a heart attack or something, and it was something else. They had some help. There's this is a different, probably subject for a different show, and I would actually like to talk about this in depth. But there, I've heard and read different things like about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, about Herbert Hoover, Joseph Stalin. All of them died of unnatural causes, although their deaths appeared to be natural.
Yeah, actually, recently I've seen the question that was Roosevelt assassinated come up because like people bring that up because there was the business plot coup, to supposedly take out Roosevelt in 1934, and there was like a very reactionary element of society, the American Liberty League types, like like William Randolph Hearst types, the Rockefeller types, who at least in the early 30s, were very like anti-Roosevelt. Father Coughlin was, very anti-Roosevelt, for instance. Like if you read the book Undercover by John Ray Carlson, he actually like infiltrated the Coughlinite social justice movement. But you'll see like there's all sorts of like because they were equating Roosevelt as a Jew. So like they were saying, the Jew deal is being rammed down our throats, and like it was also like there's propaganda calling Roosevelt like a Soviet communist. And I guess you could say there was some underlying truth to that because like the New Deal was very there are some communist you could make some communist connections to the New Deal. So but I'm saying that Roosevelt there's a ton of propaganda coming from the fascist circles saying that like Roosevelt's the big bad Jew, and there was like as Smedley Butler, like according to Smedley Butler, there was a real conspiracy to oust him supposedly in the 30s.
Well, thing is with Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, I think they got carried away because he was elected 4 times, and people began to realize, okay, this is ridiculous. We need to put the kibosh on this, because had he not died, he could have served like 20, 30 years. And I guess, whether he was eliminated, his successor, Harry Truman, was completely compliant. He did exactly as he was told. And he, I guess, died of natural causes. He was in his 80s in the early 1970s. And then I mentioned a couple other figures. Joseph Stalin, there's some speculation. Was he poisoned? And if it was the case, why do they wait so long? He was in power for 25 years, 30 years, something like that. And then there's, of course, Herbert Hoover, who using to be my go-to guy on him. He ran the FBI for almost half a century. I mean, if he could, he'd be running it now. Now, granted, he'd be like 120 some odd years old, and he would probably be covered in cobwebs. But he had no intention of retiring. And
Bribed
even
many
though
presidents, blackmailed many presidents to keep his job.
yeah,
Roosevelt being one of them.
Yeah, of course. Now, his immediate successor was L. Patrick Gray. I know he had some sort of. I wasn't going to bring this up. Oh, Patrick, I knew he has some sort of affiliation with the Catholic Church. Well, no, actually, I need to correct it. Well, I don't. Well, actually, his immediate successor was his lover, uh, Clyde Tolson. He ran the bureau for a few days, but then his actual successor, Clyde Tolson, was the
Yeah, he
acting
was
director.
Colson. All of Hoover's right-hand men were devout Catholics. I found it interestingly, the devout Jesuit-trained G. Gordon Liddy was his ghostwriter back in the this, and another big one with Tolson was I think Edward Tam. And
Yeah,
Tam actually Truman nominated Tam to as like a uh, judge on the United States court system, and he wasn't even a lawyer. So that should show you some influence of like the Catholic Church. Yeah, there's Edward. I think it was Edward Tam.
okay, yes, L. Patrick
One of
Gray.
Hoover's right hand man. Actually, just Georgia. I think I brought this name up to you. Another one of Hoover's top assistants in the 40s was Lieutenant Joseph Francis Carroll, who was the
Yes.
devout Roman Catholic, Jesuit educated, was going to become a priest, but Carroll was the first director of the Defense Intelligence Agency in the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. So yeah, just so like they're literally like you could write books on deep state connections just to Hoover. I feel like there's so much, and he's connected to the Nazis via the Interpol organization as well, and that's like a whole another rabbit hole with Hoover.
And of course, he's just like, I mean, certain figures like George Washington, like J. Edgar Hoover, develop almost mythical qualities. As to where it's almost impossible to differentiate the man from the legend. And I know that may sound trite, but J. Edgar Hoover, the perception is, uh, he fought organized crime. He brought down uh, the mafia in the 1920s. And well, actually, no, he didn't.
I would say does he have a recognition of like fighting like the communist menace in America, or like
Yes,
quelling the communist menace?
I need to correct something. He wasn't okay. According to FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, until the 1960s, the mafia did not exist. It just wasn't there. You had all these goomballs in New York and places, Chicago, who just happened to be of Italian descent. Well, actually, had to be of Sicilian descent. And even though they're from their connections were back to Europe, they didn't exist. Now, he had a reputation for being staunchly anti-communist. And briefly, during World War II, even though he was a pro-Nazi, he had the reputation for being anti-Nazi. You're playing both sides of the fence.
Although interestingly, with Hoover, John Ray Carlson writes about this was a pseudonym. I forget his full name, but he was an FBI agent who wrote a book called Undercover, like documenting his experiences infiltrating the Coughlinite organization, social justice, the Christian Front. But he writes about how like when he took his evidence to the FBI, like nothing happened. So Hoover was briefed with all of Charles Coughlin's fascist activities. Like in the book Undercover, like he writes about how like while he was undercover, like as a Coughlinite, like handing out like anti-Semitic newspapers, like he was told by like his organizers that father, like he said, to use like to paraphrase like his exact words, like he was saying that what he was told that when he was protesting, like acting as a Coughlinite, when approached by police, to say that Charles Coughlin like is allowing us to be here. So essentially, like the police gave the Coughlinites, like protection to do all of their rallies, all across America. It's just fascinating stuff. Hoover was fully briefed, by John Ray Carlson, and I'm sure like there's way more information that didn't make the book, obviously. So Hoover knew everything that was going on, and just in terms of Coughlin's fascist network, and did nothing about it.
So anyhow, it's just about 11 p.m. here. I guess it's about 2 in the morning Eastern. I need to be wrapping this up. So
Yeah, we
Or
can. Yeah, we'll get. Yeah, we'll do this quick summary. You know, just with Hoover. If I did a video on him, I recommend people watch if they haven't. But the book I read out of in that video, I've digitized. But it's called "The FBI and the Catholic Church" by Steve Rossum. But there's all
yes,
sorts of just interesting information on Hoover in that book. Like just off the top of my head, like Hoover spoke at like the Holy Cross Jesuit University commencement addresses. Like in the 1930s, Hoover would write for the Catholic newspapers. Um, Hoover, on behalf of the FBI, awarded a Jesuit priest, Robert S. Lloyd, an engraved chalice. This Jesuit priest, Robert S. Lloyd, you'll see in the book, like he spoke at 43 consecutive FBI Academy meetings. Edmund Walsh also regularly spoke at the FBI National Academy. The book goes into Hoover's relationships, with Cardinal Spellman, Fulton Sheen, Cardinal Richard Cushing, Bishop Frank Knoll from Our Sunday Visitor. All sorts of great information in that book, but that's on my archive.org page, the FBI and the Catholic Church. If I recommend you guys all check it out.
well, okay. Well, just in conclusion, I mean, I'm not going to. I'll just make reference to the points I was making earlier. Something. I'm a history buff. I have a degree in it for what it's worth, and something I noticed that I mentioned this before. I've noticed that certain patterns will repeat. And sometimes you'll have people flip scripts. It's just like it's funny how American politics is basically like professional wrestling. And I'm not being facetious when I say that, because if you look at the current president, Donald J. Trump Sr.,
Yeah, he did WrestleMania in the 90s.
but yes, well, just think about okay, I'm not sure how familiar you are with professional wrestling. I'm way more familiar with it than I should be. But it became professional in the 1950s. They've called it different things. They've had the WWE, the WWF, and well, anyhow, they use a certain lingo in professional wrestling, and this is you could say this is a metaphor for politics and life. A good guy, so to speak, is called a face. A bad guy is called a heel. And when they're in a ring, and as I said, this goes back to 1950s. When they're in the ring, um, the heel will cheat. The referee will committedly look away, and he won't catch the heel's transgressions. But if the face does the same thing, the referee will see it, and he'll get in trouble. He'll be penalized. And there's all sorts of drama involved with this. Jesse Ventura, James Llanos, a reporter asked him, "Is professional wrestling real?" And he gave this equivocal response, "Well, is opera real?" And that always struck me as odd, because you could say wrestling is like opera as well. But the so you have this dynamic, the heel versus the face. But sometimes they can switch. A face could become a heel could become a face. Enemies can become friends, and friends can become enemies. And it goes back and forth. There's fluidity. And sometimes you'll have partnerships. You'll have like combined teams. And so you could. So my point is in wrestling there's things change all the time, and they talk trash about each other all the time in the ring. Well, they say, well, last week in Chicago, you stole the belt from me, but this week here in Dallas, Texas, I'm here to take my belt back because I'm not going to let you cheat.
I was able
And it's
like politics. They all go out for drinks together after the show.
well, yes,
They're
I
all
know
close with each other.
this is completely ridiculous, and this is absurd. Are you kidding me? But that's how politics appears to be. And for the last 2+ years, something that the left was completely consumed with was this whole Russian collusion narrative that Donald Trump was in the back pocket of Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin basically stole the election from Hillary Clinton. because of their ages, their oxygen
Actually,
levels.
I'm pretty sure that actually the source, like the root source of this RussiaGate conspiracy is the Jesuit professor John Podesta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's come out. Like that was yeah, like I've seen that. Like a Podesta is really like he's the like when you go back to like day one of the RussiaGate craze, it's John Podesta, professor at Georgetown. You
okay.
know,
So,
we shouldn't necessarily surprise us. Just it's a resurrection of like the McCarthy witch hunts, and we know McCarthy was also Jesuit influence. But sorry, keep going, George.
well, as ridiculous as it sounds, but this is like, well, Jesuitical theater 101. I mean, they basically created Hollywood, and Donald Trump
Oh,
is not so much.
they literally did. Like it was a full. It wasn't just like a Jesuit educated like executive, like a literal fourth vow ordained Jesuit priest Daniel Aloysius Lord S.J. wrote the Hollywood Motion Picture Code. And then
Yeah,
after in 1968 when it became modernized to the current system, you like rated R, PG-13, all the way down, you know, rated G, like the current rating system. It was a Knight of Malta, Jack Valenti, devout Roman Catholic, a papist, who took over. Like they've all
yeah,
they it's not like an understatement to say the Jesuits literally like like own Hollywood. Like they do. Like you can read the journal article done by Johns Hopkins University. It's on my archive.org page called "The Jesuit Contribution to Theater." This was done by a scholarly academic journal. Like the Jesuits invented broadcasting. Like
yes.
it actually says like in terms of like modern stage directing, like the Jesuits were literally the inventors of it. And so like you should read. I recommend everyone read that. Like it's like an 8-page journal article, but you'll see that. And the journal article says the Jesuit theater was exclusively a propaganda theater, and like the whole message of a Jesuit theater film, like a Jesuit production, was to get the audience to submit to the spiritual message of the movie or of the
Mhm.
production.
Okay.
It's,
Well,
it was all about how these yeah, it was all about how these all these Jesuit and this has resonated because this is especially what goes on to this day. The article talks about how the Jesuit theater would flood the viewer with like an assault of like a barrage on their senses. Just all sorts of like stuff going on. And think about today, like with all like the movies with like special effects and like explosions and everything going on everywhere. It's literally just like a blitz on the senses. That was part of the morale of the Jesuit theater. I just wanted to stress that, but what you said, George, is it's not an understatement to say that the Jesuits like literally control Hollywood. Like it's true.
okay. Well, speaking of their boy, Donald Trump, who went to school for him, and three of his kids were at least partially educated by them. Tiffany and Eric went to Georgetown. They graduated. Ivanka attended Georgetown. And of course, you've talked about Trump's sister, the judge. I forgot her name, first name, but so, and of course, his current wife, Melania, is a Roman Catholic. She brought her own rosary beads when they went to the Vatican a couple of years ago. Now, speaking of Donald Trump, he's noted for a couple of things. He's a businessman. He's a real estate tycoon, but he's also an entertainer. He has over 120 listings on IMDb for commercials,
It's like
interviews.
yeah, it's like a lifelong seasoned professional actor.
Yes, I mean he's done a number of cameos in movies. Like he was in one of the Home Alone movies. He was on TV shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel Air, Spin City. Now, granted, as I said, he's usually just playing himself. But as I said, he's been
Oh no,
groomed for
he's
this
been a
role.
pop culture icon for a while, George. Like even it's too bad, but like, I covered this. This whole death may have been Jesuit theater in itself, but like the recent rapper Mac Miller, who died recently, but he made a song called Donald Trump in like 2011. This is like 5 years before Trump would become president. But that song, even before Trump became president, that song had over like 120 million views on YouTube. Like, it was one of the
Oh,
most popular songs in the genre of hip hop, and it was named Donald Trump. And just in rap music alone, like if you go through the '90s, just rap music, like Donald Trump's name, like has appeared in like hundreds of different songs. Just like casually, like Donald Trump's name will be dropped like in a lyric. So like he's literally been like an icon in like pop culture for quite some time.
And of course, we've talked about this before. You can say the
Oh,
same thing about.
just really quickly, George. Just if I hope this sticks, but pop culture, I hope people start calling it Pope culture. I just wanted to mention that quick. Sorry, keep going, George.
Very good. I think you've mentioned that before. And it's a somewhat similar situation with Ronald Reagan. One of his leading film roles, and I may have mentioned this before, was the 1940 film News Rock All American. The producer of that was Lloyd Bacon, who went to school at the University of Santa Clara. It starred Pat O'Brien, who's a devout Irish Roman Catholic. He went to Marquette Prep, Marquette University. He went to the churches of the Jesu, or however you say it, in Milwaukee, where he's an altar boy. He usually played Catholic priests. He did a number of films with his fellow Irish Catholic, James Francis Cagney, Jimmy Cagney. So the film New Rock and All American, takes place at Notre Dame. It came out a few years after, I guess, the Hollywood production code. So it was just a complete. Now, granted, Notre Dame is not Jesuit, but close enough. It was a complete propaganda piece for the Catholic Church, and that was basically the vehicle that launched Ronald Reagan's career. Now, he was this.
Actually,
He was
George, in the code, it was actually written in the code by the Jesuit that priests will not be shown in like a negative light. And what does that mean? It means like the Catholic Church will not be allowed to be ostracized in any matter in these Hollywood films.
Well, they could be shown, in a funny light, like they could be buffoons or something, or they could be bumbling, but they're not supposed to be portrayed as being evil or sinister or anything along those lines. And of course, one of the characters in the movie is a Father John Callahan, played by, I forgot the actor, it was a British actor, Donald something or another. So you have this movie that takes place in Notre Dame. It's supposed to take place in the 19 teens, so about 20 years before it actually came out. So with that movie, you got Ronald Reagan's name launched out there in the pop culture. This is 1940, more than a quarter century before he became governor of California, and 40 years before he became president or elected president of the United States. So people had known Reagan's name for decades prior to him holding any office. So there's a similar situation with Trump. People had known his name for 20, 30 years prior to him becoming president. And so that's one of the things. And you could say they didn't have to spend a dime on either one of them in terms of their PR, in terms of say, getting people to recognize his name. One of the problems most politicians have, particularly if they're running for a high office like president or governor, is people don't know who they are. That was not the case with Trump or Reagan.
I'm sure this is exactly what happened with Ronald Reagan, but with Donald Trump, with the 2016 election cycle, he was getting just an enormous amount of press coverage.
Yes.
I've just seen this stat, well, Bernie Sanders was like a puppet the whole time, but just like compared to Bernie Sanders, like Trump was getting like 30 times more media coverage, even by supposed like left wing networks that you would think would be endorsing Bernie Sanders. But Donald Trump was covered just nonstop, 24/7. I'm sure that's exactly what happened with Reagan because they have so much box office appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like their movie stars. Like people tune into Donald Trump. Like people are anxious to see what he says next. Like it's like a movie star appeal to it.
Oh, okay. With Reagan, there was a little difference in that either Reagan. Well, first, for what it's worth, they're both the only two divorcees who've ever been elected president. Reagan Trump was the only one who, with multiple divorces, to be elected president, and that's a fairly trivial point.
Well, I think
Um,
Reagan was more liked. Like Reagan, like I think everyone kind of like Ronald. Like it was kind of like at least the way Reagan was portrayed. Like it was kind of like, oh, how can you not like Ronald Reagan? He's so funny, he's so cheerful. He's always having a good time. He's always smiling. But like Trump, he didn't. Reagan didn't say like like I don't know. Maybe our culture wasn't as politically correct then, but Reagan wasn't saying comments about about the Muslims that like Trump was. Like he wasn't creating as much like racial animosity with his statements.
well, yeah, and of course, Reagan did have his detractors, but a big difference between Reagan and Trump was the internet. Um, you didn't have Reagan left in office in 1980, left the White House in 1989, 30 years ago, and the internet was launched that year, but it would still be several years before it became a popular. It wouldn't be till like around the year 2000 or so that the internet was mainstream to where you had large numbers of people on it. Um, so you could say the internet helped, played a big part, in Trump's election. It did did play a hand in like Obama and W. Bush.
Yeah,
Um,
I think in some way it worked. Like him being on his Twitter feed made like the average American feel like, oh, like he's using Twitter, like he's more relatable to me. Like most candidates wouldn't do this. You know what I
oh,
mean?
okay.
And so
Well,
I think that may have been effective even in a way, try to get making him seem more relatable to the average like American.
it's probably some college intern who's posting those tweets, but that's just my opinion.
Oh, I agree. Yeah,
Uh,
he's not doing the tweets, but he's given the impression that like he's engaging with his viewers, like his followers in the Twitter sphere.
and he probably has several people doing the tweets. And it's not just Trump; it's probably most political figures. Uh, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie, you name it, AOC. I'd imagine they have staffers who do that. That's all they do. Is just they take care of the social media.
Oh yeah, and that's
And
everywhere. That's
I'm
in
not sure.
Canada, England, Holland, France. Yeah, that's all over the world. All the politicians they have like social media staffs. Even like celebrities, like art, singers and actors, don't do their social media posts.
And of course, but you see their icon. And, so you assume they're actually posting things, and they. I mean, how would somebody like Donald Trump have time to do that? I mean, doesn't he have enough? I mean, yes. I mean, being a puppet is a full-time job. I mean, if even
Oh,
though,
it absolutely is. Like
I
this
mean,
came out in the '70s. This came out with Operation Mockingbird, and Philip Agee was Jesuit trained, but he wrote about this in his book Inside the Company. But it came out that what the CIA would do with certain news journalists and like in particular news journalists, and this is still prominent today. Like Rachel Maddow, for instance, on MEC, is a CIA agent. But what the CIA would do is like they would write entire columns for journalists. Like they would write the news story for the journalist, and then they would stamp the journalist's name on the CIA report that they're now releasing through like the New York Times.
mhm.
For instance, so
Now I'm not.
it was a brilliant way for you. So it's a brilliant way for the system to parrot propaganda by getting puppets to just speak regurgitated talking points from the deep state.
Well, something. I'm not an apologist for Ronald Reagan, but something I will say about him when he was governor of California and was president, and I've read this from different sources, is that yes, he was a puppet and he basically read speeches off of teleprompter, but he would actually go to the speeches beforehand and take a pen and say, "Really, I can't say that because he was an ex-actor," and he said, people are going to buy that. Would you mind rewriting that, or would you change it to this? I mean, so he was a little bit more hands-on, whereas it seems like subsequent presidents just say, hey, I'll just read you whatever you put in front of me. If you say, hey, my hair is on fire and I'm bleeding out of every orifice of my body, and have a nice day. It's just like, um, this was especially true with Bill Clinton.
Yeah, actually,
Um,
there's a video on the internet of Bill Clinton like in between like an interview where he's like zoning out like in front of the camera, like
yes,
while his medical team's like prepping him with all this stuff. But yeah, you see in the video that like he's a complete puppet.
yes, and of course, okay. This is my last point. You were talking about our dear friend Mae Brussel, and one of the things she was talking about in one of her videos. I've only listened to like maybe 12 or 15 of them out of hundreds. Um, is mind control and mind manipulation, and that's something that the CIA and other organizations have been doing since at least the 1950s to various people, actors, musicians, things like that. Now, this may sound a bit kooky, but according to her, most of your prominent movie stars, like Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, uh, going back to the 50s and 60s, Elvis Presley, were mind controlled somehow. Now, I'm not exactly sure why or how, but it would make sense because if you're going to be uh, an actor, actress, rock and roll star, and you're going to be doing things that you normally wouldn't want to do, that makes sense for you to be controlled, like a rapper or something like that. And I mentioned this on the show last year uh, before you joined us. I mentioned this to Johnny. There have been a number of cases in the last 10, 15 years of prominent entertainers having meltdowns, uh, like Britney Spears, uh, Miley
Well,
Cyrus.
Lindsay Lohan.
Yeah, well, Lindsay Lohan. Well, when they become adults, they'll usually engage in very erratic, bizarre behavior. They'll shave their heads. They'll get a bunch of tattoos. They'll
Yeah,
get drunk.
yeah, keep going, George. But I think personally that's like a continuation of the MK Ultra research. And
Okay, so
just
they'll
quickly
have.
at Georgetown, I mentioned this guy's name earlier. I think I pronounced it wrong, but I had my Washington Post article up here. It's called "CIA Tried to Use Georgetown Medical Center in the 1950s." This came out in like the 1970s when the Post was doing somewhat decent journalism. It's like it's just an abomination what it turned into. But okay, but it says here, but the guy's name was Dr. Charles Getschiker, spelled
Okay.
G-E-S Gesschicker. He was the doctor at Georgetown that was doing all of the MK Ultra research. And just in this, the Washington Post says, according to Doctor, says I'm paraphrasing here, but it says Dr. Matthew McNulty. He's the head of the Georgetown Medical Center at this time. And now I'm quoting from the article. It says the evidence, he said, referring to Dr. Matthew McNulty, said that the CIA indeed tried to establish a secret mind control research center at the university. Um, but yeah, people should look into that because like, I think it's no coincidence that one of the main research centers for the MK Ultra research was at the most powerful Jesuit university like, in the world. It's not a coincidence. Um, and like Alan Dulles was one of the going back to Project MK Ultra. Alan Dulles was one of the main guys initiating it. Alan Dulles had a Jesuit priest as his nephew. Dulles himself was
Yes.
doubtlessly, I think, a knight of Malta as well. But I think what these celebrity meltdowns are is an extension of this MK Ultra research program. You know, extrasensory perception research into like multiple personalities. I think Kanye West is actually a victim of some MK Ultra stuff right now. Because if people don't know Kanye West, you should after Kanye West was on stage a couple years ago, and he made like a speech against Jay-Z and like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. It wasn't a great speech, but he was trying to do, I think, his best to try to speak to some power. But Kanye West ended up being thrown in like a medical facility for 3 weeks, the same medical center where Michael Jackson was located, where he was given up all those drugs unauthorized. But Kanye West, like once he came out of this medical facility, he just looked off, and he actually did like a press conference with Donald Trump right afterwards, and he looked like completely zoned out when he was walking out with Donald Trump. Like it literally looked like Donald Trump was his like handler during that interview exchange. Like Kanye West is usually like super energetic and all over the place, and like he had his head down, couldn't even look at the camera. So like the celebrity MK Ultra stuff, I think it is MK Ultra. I think it's doubtlessly an extension of it. And like it's not a conspiracy. Like people need to realize like the MK Ultra stuff is not a conspiracy theory. Like it was disclosed by like the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, like San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Tribune, like all like the most establishment papers, like confirm that this program did in fact exist.
Well,
so, like, it's not a conspiracy theory.
Well, one of the things that Mae Brussel mentioned is I heard her talk about MK Ultra more than once. And as I said, that goes back to at least the 1950s. So you had an era where you had a large number of Nazis or ex-Nazis, well, I'm not sure if we can call them ex-Nazis, who were in America who played a heavy part in that. And of course, now I'll have to finish this up on our next show. But you also had a number of these Nazis who were
saying, yeah, just one of them was Dr. In the U.S. was Dr. Emil Schreiber. He was one in particular to MK Ultra, and you know Joseph Mengele, like the Angel of Death. A lot of the MK Ultra research, from what I've read, actually originates from Mengele's guinea pig experiments that he was doing over in Nazi Germany. But Mengele, with help of the Roman Catholic priest Krunislav Draganovich and the CIA, located down to Paraguay, I think, and he became like a minister in the dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner, for instance. But yeah, you're right though, George. Like, there was literally like an infestation, really all over the North and South American continents. But yeah, the USA got flooded with Nazis post paperclip. Actually, and another name for paperclip. I think this was the predecessor, but there was something called Operation Bloodstone. Mm-hmm. And Operation Bloodstone was just essentially like another paperclip program, and there was also Operation Sunrise, which was another predecessor program to paperclip. And it was in Operation Sunrise, according to CIA's own documentation, that you had Alan Dulles meeting with Heinrich Himmler in Switzerland, in Bern. And it's fascinating because Mae Brussel has said that like the first real coup that took place in the United States was in Bern, Switzerland, when Alan Dulles, with Edmund Walsh, Wild Bill Donovan, was plotting with high-level Nazis like Mengele, Otto von Bolschwing, Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann had a son that was a Jesuit priest, for instance. But Mae Brussel says that it was during this planning that set up ultimately Operation Paperclip, which was truly like, according to Mae Brussel said this, and it no doubt was a coup d'etat, but she said it was like the first true like deep state like coup d'etat like in the United States.
Okay.
And no doubt it was. I think if you're going to go full United States, I think you would have to say the Abraham Lincoln assassination was one of the deep state coup d'etats.
Okay, and of course, we're talking about paperclip, but something that was contemporaneous of that time were the Nuremberg trials, 46 to 48, which was something like a dozen or so court proceedings. And this was just, the more I look into it, the more I begin to realize the whole Nuremberg proceedings was a complete psyop. It's just simply, they're basically throwing the people a bone. So, okay, we'll try a few of these Nazis and we'll execute some of them. Basically, for the most part, low-level.
Actually, you know what they did? They executed the Roman Catholic priest Monsignor Tiso in Slovakia before the press could actually like release like the brutality of his regime and the fact that like a Roman Catholic priest was literally running like a fascist like dictatorship with like firing squads and concentration camps all over the place. But I think they killed Tito because they didn't want more people figuring out that like a Roman Catholic priest was in charge of a literal fascist, like hot fascist state. But you're right. Like,
Okay,
essentially,
so
they essentially executed the small fry Nazis and let like the real players like off the hook.
yes, and of course, they several of them remain in Germany and they became prominent, but a large number of them, as we've discussed, ended up going up for them all over the Americas, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, places. Some even went to Russia. Now, because several of them, what was his name, Galen, Reinhard Galen, was a devout, lifelong Roman Catholic, trained by the Jesuits, Knight of Malta. He helped basically to establish the Mossad in
Actually,
the
you know, Galen, I've seen
1950s.
a source. According to Covert Action Information Bulletin, this was their number 25 issue. They didn't give the name, but they said Reinhard Galen's brother was an advisor to the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta.
Okay, I
Which
did not know.
I think which with all the other the background you gave on Galen just now, it checks out.
Okay, so people don't seem to realize, the vast majority of people don't realize that current events and what they think is history is an illusion. It has some elements, it has some basis in reality, but it's almost thoroughly been completely manipulated. As I said earlier in the show, the whole Cold War was completely manufactured. You had both sides working together. You had the KGB over Russia, and you had the CIA in America, and you had other players like British MI6 and so forth. But they're all the time they're working together. Now, granted, people suffered and people died by the millions all over the world, but secretly, all the players were working together. And the same thing, what is commonly called World War II. All the figures were working together. Hitler was working with Stalin during the war.
I'm saying, like, but that's very
They
natural.
actually,
The Vatican being like just by its very nature being an international organization, like it's just like just given that fact, like given the Vatican is international, it should be expected then, with given geopolitical war conflict, that there will be Vatican agents on both sides. Just given the fact that they're not restricted to just mere they're not restricted to combat from the point of view of just like a single nation state. Like the Vatican, transcends that. They're the most ancient State Department on the planet. They go back to like the year 600.
okay, and this is something people don't realize, and this is something I did not realize until relatively recently. You're talking about 2, 3 years ago. That contrary to popular belief, the Nazis did not lose World War II. The German people lost. They lost big time. Millions died, millions suffered, and millions continued to suffer after the war in what under the brutal, vicious boot of communism in the East. But most of the figures, the leaders of the Nazi Germany, as we just said, through paperclip and various other uh, machinations, got out of Germany, and most of them lived to ripe old ages, and continued to live very prominent lives of luxury.
Actually, I quote this. I quote this in the preface. Otto Ambros, the Nazi chemist at IG Farben, even said like, "Hey, Ed, it's kind of funny now that now I'm helping the Americans."
Okay,
He even
so,
acknowledged that. But, all of these. You're right though. These, and it wasn't just like they moved to the United States. Like these high-level Nazis became employees. The Central Intelligence Agency, employees of the U.S. Army,
or
U.S. Chemical Warfare, employees at NASA.
or
NASA.
NASA.
Werner von Braun became the head of NASA's rocket program. They're like a Nazi who was responsible for Jew roundups over in Europe. Like it's crazy. Like it's honestly fascinating, and people it's all declassified too. Like the reason people don't know about it is just like the mainstream media has been so effective at just avoiding the question altogether. Like
Mhm.
recently I saw there was a book that was recently published. I haven't read this book, but there was a book recently published on Operation Paperclip. Even I think it was by Annie Jacobson. was the author, but a recent book, it came out in like 2014. I think it sold a lot of copies. But like, this is like anyone can go also in the CIA reading room, go into the declassified file section. Like, for example, through Mae Brussel, she showed me the connection about this character Nikolai Malixa. And I did some more research on this guy, but Malixa is a very interesting character. He was the richest man in Romania, the richest industrialist really in Eastern Europe. Like, and I read through the book The American Swastika by Charles Hyam, that Malixa also got into like a cartel agreement with the Soviet economy while Stalin was in power, which is interesting. So he was actually an official like communist and fascist at the same time. But Mae Brussel talked about how Malixa was like personal friends with Richard Nixon, and how Nixon like personally signed a bill to get Nikolai Malixa entrance into the United States. And Nikolai Malixa actually founded a corporation called the Western Tube Corporation in Richard Nixon's hometown. It was the address for this Western Tube Corporation was the Bank of America office in Richard Nixon's hometown, where Nixon had worked before, for instance. But like on the CIA reading room, I was just so shocked. Like, if you type in Nikolai Malixa, like there's literally like hundreds of declassified documents, like from like U.S. officials admitting that Malixa is a fascist and a Nazi, and he was allowed into this country, like no problem. It was even I think it was Senator Seller. What's his first name? Forgot. Senator? Yeah. He was from the Hart-Celler Act, but Senator Seller in a declassified CIA memo even commented that it's amazing that he commented the hypocrisy of Richard Nixon. He said Richard Nixon is like on these like vocal anti-communist crusades while he's letting like a known communist Nikolai Malixa, correct connections to Stalin into the United States. But more interesting, Malixa he wasn't just a communist. He was a fascist, and he personally funded the Romanian Iron Guard, which was one of the most biggest fascist legions in the world back in the 30s. But he's just a good example. He was allowed to come into the United States like no problem, and he set up like multiple shell companies in the United States. One Western Tube Corporation. He set up a shell company with Richard Nixon. For instance, but kudos to Mae Brussel. Was one of the few voices, back in the 70s. Especially voices with the radio platform that was talking about this stuff.
Well, actually, Eric, I just got a message. I actually need to be going. So, what would you like to? What would you like to do another show?
We'll do. How does Friday work? Friday or Thursday or Friday, something like that.
Okay, so probably like Thursday evening or so.
Yeah, let's shoot for that. If anything changes with my schedule, I'll let you know.
Okay, so you're talking about 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. midnight Eastern.
Yes, 11. Yeah, we'll do 10 or 11. And just quickly, I'll read some of the comments, George, of some of the people. Interestingly, some dude says over in Holland, a week before the Christchurch shootings, there was the local Senate elections. That's just interesting. I'm sure that there's going to be possible gun control. Holland, I don't know the specific gun laws in Holland, but they will probably use this event, to tighten gun laws worldwide. Let me just see if there's any other comments here. And just apparently, what was this here? Johnny's list says a month before the shooting, a Freemason lodge was opened in Christchurch. I'll have to look. That's interesting because Freemasons another big hoax. This hoax wasn't as big as this one, but the Trayvon Martin hoax in the U.S. His dad was made like a 33-degree Mason, like right after, like during the hoax. So like Freemasonry is used. I saw a comment also on what was this here? It was on Muhammad. Let me see here. Because recently I've actually read this in like the Guardian today. Like there was I don't know if you saw this, George. There was a law that was passed in the European Union, I think last year, it's now like a crime to talk about the Prophet Muhammad's relationship to Aisha. she that was like the controversial relationship in the Quran, where she said to be like 9 years old when the Prophet married her. But it's now actually like a federal crime to, like, you can go to jail for talking about the Prophet Muhammad. So, and I'm pretty sure the guy who's like the Chief Justice of the European Union, he went to the Lycée Le Grand Jesuit school in Paris. He's Belgian. I forget his first name. You know, but it's interesting that the Jesuit-controlled European Union is tightening on free speech like that, protecting Islam. It's just interesting. It shows like there's a relationship between Islam and the Vatican. And in 2007, Saudi Arabia and the Vatican, where King Abdullah went to Saudi Arabia and was knighted into the Order of the Golden Fleece. Let me see if there's anything else in here. Yeah, actually, it's getting late though, George. I won't keep you waiting. Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. I appreciate everyone for watching. Appreciate all the insight in the comments. Yeah, and we'll go live Thursday or Friday this week. So yeah, take care, everyone. All the best.
Okay,
I'll see you soon.
Take care. Okay, bye.
All right, bye. See you, everyone.